Shane's a road warrior. He's got no excuse to be sleeping.
He needs to be editing.
I built an autopilot for that Explorer, don't you know?
Is that thing still going strong after turkey season?
Actually, I had to do some transmission work to it. When I went to Michigan, actually when I was hunting Wisconsin before I went to Michigan, I noticed that like I'd hear the fans like like a dump truck when it's taking off from the stoplight. And I'm like, why does that sound so loud? And then we got going up the interstate, and it was making that noise, and we pulled over. I flagged my buddy down with the headlights when he was in front of me, and I said, well, my truck's making a lot of extra fan noise for no reason. And anyway, we hunted, and then I went home, and then I went to Michigan. And I've always known my transmission slips a little bit for the last few years, but I've learned to work with it. It's just like you got to let off the throttle at the right point, and then it shifts. And I'm like, at some point, this transmission's going to go. Anyway, I drove to Michigan, and I've never really paid attention to my RPM gauge as far as like when I'm doing 75 on the interstate and I got the cruise set.
Yeah.
And it was like 3,000 RPMs or over 3,000 RPMs the whole way. And my fuel economy hasn't been the greatest the last few years. Coming back from Michigan, I was like, I think my overdrive's gone in my truck. And that's why it's I think the transmission fluid's getting too hot. That's why that fan's kicking in to try to cool it. And that's why I'm at 3,000 RPM. So I knew what the fix was because an Explorer is, or that particular transmission for Explorers and Fords in general is so widely used. Mm-hmm. There's fixes out there. Like there's a company in Wisconsin that sells these little servos. And what happens is the servos wear out, fluid slips through, and it slips changing gears, or you lose a gear. Mm-hmm. Well, they've made an adapter. You just swap the servos out. There's a little bushing in there. It kind of clogs the hole and makes it function again. You can get another 200,000 miles. Mm-hmm. $300 for the parts. Do it yourself in your garage or in your driveway. So I spent a day doing that. Took it around the block. It shifted better than it's ever shifted. It's smooth. Got on the interstate doing 75. I'm doing 2,000 RPMs. So now I'm getting like 3 or 4 miles to the gallon more.
That's basically a new rig.
Yeah.
Wow.
I can make it to 500,000 miles. I think it's 300, close to 340,000 miles on it now.
That's great. I like hearing that. My truck has a powertrain warranty on it, lifetime. So as long as it's in my name, something goes wrong with it. And I just had to get a new transmission at 96,000.
Wow. What kind of vehicle?
F-150.
It's Ford. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Seems to be a trend, the transmission. Well,
but at least I got that warranty.
Yeah.
So that's nice. But I'm hoping to just.
Maybe that's why they added it, because they know it's a problem.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
We'll fix that. We'll just give them a free fix if it goes wrong.
Yeah, which was nice because it was going to cost me a lot of money and it didn't cost me any. So that's good. Yeah. So I want to hear about some big woods hunting. So that's where the conversation is going to start. I know that you do some of that, and I'm really interested to hear about all the things that you're thinking about. I don't really have a direction other than talking deer hunting, talking things learned, and just asking questions along the way about, some of the things that you've been picking up on and what you're thinking about. So I guess to start, to get the conversation rolling, what are some of the things that you're excited about applying this season that you've learned in the past season or two?
I think for me, it's finding more locations that are similar to other locations that I've had great success in, and expanding my reach.
Yep.
Because it's taken so long to find these little hidden gem type spots where it's like, man, these things could be good every year around this time frame, and you get this data, library built up, and then you look for other spots like it, and then you find one. It's like, after 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, multiple different properties, you get this little library built up, and maybe 10 years down the road we'll be having this conversation, and I'll have 20, 30 of these spots that they can just you can't even bounce around quick enough to scout them all. That's kind of the goal, but it certainly seems like in an area that's so vast, it's like you can kind of break it down a little bit, and it'll take you a while, more so than properties that are more, I guess, cookie cutter, more typical, river bottom, hill country, where there's people just generally know there's enough information around about how to hunt
broken habitat, right? When you're limited on cover, it helps you pinpoint an area a little bit more efficiently because you're writing off giant areas where if you got solid timber, it's a lot more to sort through.
And you could still find those little pockets of diversity. And a lot of times that's what I look for when I'm even looking at maps. I'm trying to find those diverse pockets. And sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes the maps might not be recent enough. Maybe you got a logging operation that's active in the maps from 8 years ago. So I like to look at the more recent maps just to make sure that, like, okay, all the logging activity is current, or I just drive around and figure it out that way. But even sometimes just walking underneath the canopy, you'll find stuff that wasn't obvious. And I can even remember looking at areas on a map initially and saying, like, here, 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 and here, like trying to apply things that I learned hunting swamps or marshes or hills in the past. And some of those areas were good, and a lot of them had hunting pressure. And then there's these other places that just over the course of hunting throughout the season, you pick up on, you see sign, and it's like, oh, never thought of this spot potentially being good. Maybe this is night sign or whatever. And over time, it's like, oh no, this actually is like a good daytime spot. I wouldn't have expected it, but now that I look at it again on the map, it does make sense big picture wise. And those are the type of spots I'm telling you about, like, okay, I need to build a library of those.
Yeah. So what do some of these places look like aside from diversity? Like, more specifically, are you seeing oaks? Are you seeing a certain type of spruce? Are you seeing water? Like, what are some of the standout things that you've picked up on that you're going to be looking for on the map when trying to add to that list of places?
Yeah, so I usually like to find a combination of, we'll say, old growth trees, young growth trees, water, like in that kind of a combination, and maybe even, you know, some sporadic, like super recent clear cut where it's just like weeds, grasses, berries, things like that, or just kind of open like CRP type grasses. Like, the more mixture of those types of, you know, different levels of cover, I feel like the better, at least in terms of finding a starting point.
So do you think that when you have that clear cut or CRP grasses that you mentioned, do you feel like that's just some sort of break that the deer are attracted to naturally from like a feeding standpoint? Like, there's just more in that area that they're able to feed on? Or do you think that they're bedding in those areas, or what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of both. Like, take a clear cut, for example. Where I'm at, when you do get a clear cut, the first things that'll pop up are just like weeds and, like, you know, briars and berries, and it's just, you know, so thick you wouldn't want to walk through it for the first couple of years. And then, like, it seems like sometimes deer might feed in those, but not necessarily be traveling through them or using them as much, with the exception of, like, the packed down, you know, tracks that the machinery was using. But then eventually that stuff grows up to the point where it's more suitable as bedding cover, and it continues to grow. And then at that point, it's more like aspens, you know, poplar type trees that are taking over. And then those will eventually get big enough to where, like, you start to see a lot of rubs in them. And then they get big enough to where it's like, oh, now you can start to walk through them. You still wouldn't think of it as a place to, like, climb a tree or put a stand up or something like that, but you can kind of work your way around to kind of see underneath it. And that's the age of those clear cuts where you start to see a lot of rut activity. Like, the does will bed in and around them a lot, especially if they got weird shapes to them, or maybe it's a clear cut where it had butted up against a swamp, and so it's got this irregular edge of where the high ground left, and then you got bedding kind of all around it. And then sometimes, like, right in the middle, you have, like, these big hub scrape. Even if it's, like, mostly flat, the elevation's maybe like 5 or 10 feet. And you can put a camera on a place like that, and over like a 3-day span, you might get like 7 different bucks that show up in daylight. And then it's like, okay, now how do you hunt a spot like that, and how do you, you know, find multiples of those? And that's just like one example, like the clear cut example. And eventually those get big enough to where, like, those aspens get super big, and then, you know, I'm maybe trying to find other stuff that looks more similar to the age where I think it's the best from a hunting standpoint. Swamps, I think, are always good, but at least I've found that swamps tend to attract other hunters as well, especially on, like, the edges of them. You know, tamarack swamps, spruce swamps. I find a lot of tree stands in those types of areas from both bow hunters and gun hunters. You know, you might be scouting in the spring, walking across the layer of ice, and you're like, oh man, like, if you were a rifle hunter, that'd be a great tree. And you walk up to it, and it's got screw-in steps. It's like, that guy could go up in that tamarack, and he could, you know, see 150 yards clear across all of this, you know, dogwood, and people definitely do it. And that was the type of stuff that I was initially looking for when I would first scout some of these areas. I just go right to that.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, oaks, it's like, it just depends on the particular habitat. Like, you'll find these oak ridges that, you know, it might be one pocket where it's like you got a dozen big white oaks. And then I'll just go check them every year to see if they're going to be dropping that year.
Mm-hmm.
But then that might be the only pocket for, you know, a square mile.
Yeah.
And then black bears might be in there pretty heavy too. And there's like this interaction, it seems like sometimes between black bears and deer that I still haven't totally figured out. But there'll be like, you know, long spans where I just get like nothing but bears on camera. And then they'll stop getting bears, I'll start getting deer. And then other scenarios where it's like a bear goes through and there's a deer like 20 minutes behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly what that relationship is. I've talked to a few guys that seem to think that bears will be somewhat dominant and, you know, push deer, take the preferential, you know, acorns if there's only like a certain bit of them. But I tend to find that, at least for me, early season is much more difficult than it is in other habitat types.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like I can call my shots as well and say, like, here's the bedding, here's exactly where we're going to feed. Like, I can slip in there really close and figure it out. Early season, a lot of times, like, I might just continue to scout and or just hunt areas I know there's going to be a lot of does in.
Mm-hmm.
Like this year, I'll probably just be hunting with my traditional bow and like trying to fill a couple tags early season while at the same time still collecting data and get some scouting info.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like in the years that I have started hunting big woods more, the time frame that really stands out more than anything else is just that late October time frame. For a lot of the reasons that, you know, people across the Midwest like hunting late October. But I tend to see that there's maybe slight differences as well compared to the average opinion of what people see.
What are some of those differences?
Well, how many times have you heard, okay, you find a great scrape, near bedding, and then let's say third week of October, you'll get that buck that'll show up on a certain day within a couple days, and he'll keep hitting it at night, day after day, and then as you get later and later into the month, he'll get a little bit closer to evening, a little bit closer, and then finally, like, you get that cold front late October, shooting light, he's there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's your opportunity. And what I tend to see more often than not is that in some of those great scrape areas, it might be a 3-day window. Let's say it's October 24th to 26th, where I got 8 different bucks coming through, all in daylight, a couple more at night. They're all coming from different directions, all different times of the day. And then maybe in another spot in the same, general area, it's like a 2-day shift or a 3-day shift. And then there's other spots where just a steady stream, like you don't go a day between like October 16th through like November 11th. You don't go more than a day that there's not a daylight picture of a buck on it. And again, a lot of different bucks. Like, it would be hard to say, based on these pictures, I need to be in there like tomorrow and expect moving from this area. Like, it was still a little bit of it seemed random.
Yeah. Significantly less of a pattern.
Yeah.
Than maybe an area like around here in Iowa where you've got these timbered draws and these specific food sources or destination food sources, if they're not making that same pattern every day. And I think of, when you say cookie cutter, a great cookie cutter example that you would find here, for example, would be, where there's a thick spot, where there's a staging area food source fairly close to that, and then there's a destination food source. So you can kind of backtrack that. You could walk a field edge and look for scrapes, find a scrape with a big track in it. Then you kind of backtrack to some oaks that you can see in the timber. There's a rub there, and maybe another buck track and some feeding sign under some oaks. Then you look further down in there and you can see maybe either on your map or a visual, there's a thicket there. And they kind of get consistent with that pattern until those food sources change. So maybe the crops are no longer available or they eat all the acorns. Then they'll shift, but those patterns tend to last a little bit longer, where in a big wood setting, they may be in a spot for a couple of days, and the next thing you know, they're 2 miles over here in a totally different area, and then they loop back around. Is that kind of what you're seeing?
Yeah,
it feels like
there's some areas that it seems like the deer will be in all year, and there's other areas where they're definitely only in there certain times a year. And during the early part of the season, it's like, regardless if there's acorns or not, there's so much food available to them.
Yeah,
it's like they cannot take a step without being able to nibble on something.
Yeah,
just weeds, ferns, grasses, whatever. And again, the more diversity, the more you of that type of stuff you find. a lot of the examples I'm speaking of are areas that are tough to see through, and generally you're not going to have far shot opportunities. But you'll go into other big wood scenarios where it's like more mature timber and you can see, 150 yards through the canopy. And those types of areas I'm not hunting as much. So that's like kind of the pre-selection a little bit. I tend to find more sign and have more success in those areas that are a little bit denser.
Do you guys have any questions so far?
No, I'm just enjoying the conversation.
I mean, the density.
You got to understand, I'm friends with Garrett. So
Yeah,
I
you guys
know all
talk
this
about
stuff.
it.
You hear it all
I've
the
seen
time.
these trail cam pictures. I'm like,
Yeah.
man, why are you teasing me like that? Where's this place at?
Is it the diversity and the density that's keeping the deer there that you think?
Yeah, and then I think in a lot of cases it's like there's too much diversity and there's too much density. It's like it could never. That's part of why I think it's so hard to pinpoint. It's like they could be. It feels like when you're just going in, it's like they could be anywhere. Mm-hmm. And even when you go in with the intent of trying to find specific beds, it's like I found 20 beds today but I can't guarantee which one is going to be used at any given day, any given wind condition. And again, with the feed and moving around, and then you got other hunters, and you got grouse hunters. I mean, you guys got pheasant hunters, I'm sure, down here, but we have grouse hunters up by me that are especially hunting in those clear cut type areas, and you might be on the one, and all of a sudden, like a couple grouse hunters come through, and it kind of resets everything for a week. But yeah, that's a big part of it, I think, and I think also it helps deer get a little bit older because they're less effective for rifle hunters to just like shoot out an area. Like a big buck could just sit there and it seemed like a lot of times, in one area in particular, I ran cameras for like 3 years in a row, and it seemed like if a deer had gotten to like 3 years old, he was likely going to continue to grow. Last year was kind of an exception where I had 3 like really nice mature deer that all just every one of them vanished, and I still have no idea what happened to them. So I'm still looking for a little bit of closure on that.
Yeah.
But like generally speaking, it seemed like, okay, he looks like there's definitely vulnerability, but not predictability.
Right.
And so once the Orange Army goes in there and you're sitting there in opening morning, it's like, 1 shot, 2 shots, 3, 4, 5, count 20 shots in opening morning. And then all of a sudden, like, the day after muzzleloader season ends, you get that big buck again on camera.
Yeah.
And it's like
he's just been laying
he's
there,
just been
not
laying low.
moving.
Yeah.
I do have a question, and I watched the podcast with Joe Rentmeester on here, and I enjoy listening to folks like yourself and Joe that are great at killing big bucks. But one thing you two have in common is the trail cameras. I've used trail cameras. I haven't used them this year. What is your strategy in areas like that if you don't have the trail cameras available to pinpoint where the big bucks are or to see some type of pattern? If I said you can't use them anymore, what would change in your strategy?
The biggest thing that would change is I wouldn't hold out for like a particular size deer that I hope is there.
Because
you
if you actually did that,
If I have camera pictures, I like oh well, there's these 3 I'd be happy to shoot, so I'll wait for one
you've
of
gotten
those.
comments on your YouTube video where some guy said, "Why didn't you shoot that?" And I even asked you, "Why didn't you shoot that?" He's like, "Because I know there's a bigger one in there."
Yeah.
And you're not going to shoot that bigger one if you.
Well, in that case, there was like 2 bigger ones.
Yeah.
I didn't end up shooting either of them.
But you had some great video though.
Yeah.
You're sitting there like 10 yards on the ground, right?
Yeah. So I mean, that's some of those spots. Like for me to even know to put a camera in a spot, I'm thinking like, man, this is a sweet spot. So I would likely hunt it regardless. I just wouldn't.
What told you it was a sweet spot? I mean, what in particular?
Yeah, what clues? To like extend his question a little bit, what clues as far as sign are you reading that are telling you this is worth investigating to see if there's the type of buck
not
that
just
I'm
a
looking
buck,
for.
but a buck
the type
worth
of
shooting.
buck.
Yeah. So if I'm following edge, and let's say the edge is like a beaver swamp, and it's pretty thick hardwoods so there's like a corridor along the edge. And if I see big historical rubs all the way up and down that edge of that beaver swamp, okay, now I'm interested. And if there's like another clear cut in another 200 yards that does could be bedding in, like, okay, even more interested. And then maybe getting through this little pocket where you're like trying to work your way through and it's real thick. And then it just kind of opens up into this little pocket, little opening. And you see this big licking branch hanging down, and it's got a big thumb-sized thing. It's all shredded, a little bit of hair on it. And you're like, oh, okay. Look back at the map again. Like, oh yeah, they could come down here downwind of this clear cut and they could smell everything that's in there. Those are the type of areas where it's almost like once you see it, it's like, this seems like a good spot, and then you confirm and look it on the map.
Everything makes sense.
You can draw lines from location to location
yeah.
and say this is going to be a corridor that they're using to get from A to B.
Yeah, and a lot of them are somewhat rut-based, right? Like if I find like pockets of doe bedding, it's like, okay, connect the dots using transitions and, thicker areas.
It's probably somewhat like in my mind, but to a greater degree, as far as deer is concerned. I probably have a better mind in the turkey realm. But, when I was growing up and I was bow hunting stuff, I could walk through the woods and I'm like, this is a deer spot. This is a spot. Because I wasn't targeting big bucks. I just wanted to shoot a deer with my bow. I was early into my, and I just knew from being in the woods and seeing the things, my mind said, hunt here. And I would hang a stand and have deer that evening and I'd shoot one. And so I had a knack for that. I don't have a knack for finding the big bucks, but you're probably to that degree where, like you said, you walk through it, you see things.
Yeah.
Subconsciously, you're recording all that, and then you say, this is a spot.
But I will say I still struggle with finding them outside of the general rut area. Like late season, sometimes it's not as bad because you can track. Mm-hmm. But early season, it's an art. I mean, there's guys that are really good at it, like Steve Shirk, right? Like they're on those bucks all year, and it's very impressive. I haven't gotten to that level yet, but like I feel pretty good with being able to find where they're going to get to during the shift to around the rut period, and then you're going to get a lot of daylight activity usually that time of year anyway. And you asked also, it's like, how do you know if an area could have big bucks if you're not using cameras? In some of the years where I knew there was a couple big ones around, it seemed like there was more rubs, more big rubs, just like volume wise. And last fall when I mentioned like a couple of those big ones just disappeared, and I was like, oh, maybe they just shifted or whatever. And so I tried to find them and never quite could. And then the spring went back and scouted that area again, and it was like not nearly as many rubs throughout that greater area. So that makes me suspect that they did get shot or hit by a car or something.
Yeah.
Interesting. I am curious how much weight you put on finding tracks. Like if you're trying to find a big buck and you're not using cameras and you see like the scrapes, like big scrapes are a big one for me as well. Like the situation you just described really made a lot of sense to me, and I would say that that's something I also would be excited about moving forward. But also tracks are a thing that I feel just give away those punks so quick. Like all of a sudden you find that little spot where there's a trail and you can get that good gauge on track size, where there's just that perfect little spot where it's a nice track catcher. And obviously, like you said too, as you get into the winter and you get snow, that becomes even easier. But I'll put a lot of time into looking in those spots where, whether it's in the scrape itself or just on a trail that's headed down a scrape or like a transition line. And I think that a lot of times just finding those help me have confidence just picking spots within, like you said, a greater area. Okay, I saw a big track here. I'm going to start spending more time just poking around trying to figure out like a specific ambush location where I can be right on a spot that I think he's going to present a shot at.
Yeah. Now, I'm curious, do you employ anything special to try and find tracks throughout the drier portions of the year? Because it's like if you got an open scrape, like then it's pretty obvious. If you got a fresh track in there, you can see exactly how big it is. Or if you got like the edge of a road or something where they're crossing into a field or something along those lines. But if you're just in the heavy timber, it's like unless you got some type of moisture, like dew or something, where they're walking in the grass and leave an imprint of a certain size. For me, it's always been really hard to figure out, okay, there's a fresh track here and I can tell how big it is if it's not in the scrape. Is there anything that you picked up on?
My friend Ben, who I hunt with quite a bit, started telling me this, and it's as it gets drier, it gets harder. But in timber with leaves, for example, I've started getting down into the like rustle of the leaves and putting my hand into those tracks, like getting through the leaves to actually put my hand in there and feel how big that is. And eventually, You can also just kind of bring some leaves apart, but finding that fresh disturbance, just like we would when looking for turkey sign, you find the scratching and everything. Just getting in there and investigating the print that can be created from that, or even on a dry spot, like thinking of how the consistency of the soil is in like a northern setting. Sometimes you get that like mossy, fluffy, sandy soil, and just really getting in there and investigating, width, length of those tracks as well, and just paying. And a lot of times you're just making some sort of guess at a certain point, I think. I mean, like you said, the road is another good one that I like, because if you're on a gravel road, a lot of times those really big tracks will stand out, and I think that's helpful, but that's also pretty hit or miss. Sometimes big bucks, or if there's a very roadless area, they're just not crossing the road that often. But sometimes that can be a great opportunity, even in dusty, sandy stuff. Like I remember in Minnesota last year finding a track that was in a gravel road where there's all these doe tracks, and they were just kind of little stamps or little dust marks, and then his track, and it was like
super obvious.
Yeah, and gravel was pushed out of the way. Like you could tell the weight of him just wasn't
deer.
Yeah, enough to push gravel out of the way. It's like that's definitely something that I'm probably gonna. Well, shouldn't say definitely, probably, but I'm probably gonna shoot. But
how do you guys go through and pick out like sign when you're like, when I've scouted, like I've said, I listen to the podcast, I watch numerous podcasts, Dan Infault, yourself, or even THP and Joe Rentmeester. And like Joe mentioned something about antlers when they're going through the trees, they'll tick the little things, and Dan will say something about historical rubs like you mentioned earlier. And so when I'm scouting, like I was doing some scouting earlier this summer, there's so much to take in. Like I'm following a trail, I'm looking at, I forget sometimes to look at the tracks because you see a bunch of doe tracks and they start becoming, just so many, you just kind of
just
blur
a whole
them out.
bunch of like stamps
and
on
you
top of
miss
each
the bigger
other.
tracks. And then I'm like, okay, I should be looking for like historical rubs off to the side. And I forget to look for that because I'm trying to take in so much. Oh, this looks like an old bed, late season bed. Now there's a little bit of grass growing there right now. I mean, how do you digest all that and catch it and not miss it? Because I feel like I'm missing so much when I'm walking through the woods. And if I take the time to really slow down, then I'm out there for 8 hours and I've covered 100 yards,
Yeah.
You want to go first?
No. I mean, if you have a good answer, I feel like I got to calculate that a little bit.
So I think for me, I have something I'm looking for usually. Like the other day, I had a scouting mission where I just went out. I got out there in the morning. I had one mission in mind. It was like this little 15-acre pocket. Like I know I've overlooked it in the past. I want to dissect it and see what's there. And the key thing in my mind I'm looking for, I'm like, this could be a good, pre-rut spot because it sets up really similar to another spot that I have had success in. So I want to get in and get out and look exactly like, I don't really care if I see doe tracks or whatever. Like I'm looking for this specific sign. And that specific sign would be like the historical rubs in the aspens, the evidence of like, if I can find that primary scrape, like awesome. But just like how thick is it underneath there, and just generally what's my sense of how similar that situation lays up to the other one. And I ended up going in there for the first, 200 yards. It didn't seem like anything special. Kept going, kind of working the transition edge like all around it's kind of like a swamp, again, like narrowing up into that slightly higher ground that was thicker. So it was both thick, but like different kinds of thick. And eventually it got into a certain point where I was like, okay, here's like a trail that's actually, so I got on that trail and started walking, but I wasn't really paying much attention. And followed that for a little ways, and then started to see like slightly more cues that like, okay, there's more deer sign now, like just more, like another trail that intersects, more tracks, but like still not exactly what I was looking for. Ended up getting back down the transition line, made like a full loop around pretty much. And by the time I got into a certain point, again, it was like, okay, there's definitely a lot of deer sign in general in here. Maybe not fresh like right now, but it seems like they use this area quite a bit. So that means like I need to figure out if that, again, that scrape or that historical rut information is there. And so from the edge. I came up a little bit, got onto one of those trails that actually went like right down the middle of the high ground. And it was an obvious trail. Like, you know, some of those trails is like, oh, kind of seems like a deer trail. This is like one of those ones that was pretty obvious.
Cattle trail.
Yeah. And, which is, it was especially obvious since it was so hard to walk through because it was pretty thick. And the mosquitoes were just like vicious. So I'm like, you know, basically kind of tunnel vision and ignoring stuff that maybe I shouldn't be ignoring. But eventually got to a point where it was like, I came up into an area, I was like, oh, this looks like a scrape. And it wasn't even really pawed up that much, but just like visually, my eye caught what appeared to be a scrape area, even though it's, you know, it's June. Everything is leafed up. And I was like, yep, there's the licking branch. And it was sitting down there, again, like the size of my thumb, had hair in it from last year. Like clearly wasn't pawed up. Like maybe there's deer in here this time of the summer, even like, you know, hitting the licking branch, but they're not pawing it up. But like that was what I was looking for. Like that one thing that lets me know that, okay, I can at very minimum put a camera here or hunt it, and there's going to be deer activity here, like almost guaranteed late October and early November.
That exact
Yeah.
spot.
Like if I'm speed scouting this place in the future, that's the spot I'm going to check. I can just get in and get out and like check it, and then continue to kind of zigzag through that area. And it's like, oh yeah, now I'm seeing the historical rubs, you know, and that to me put together the overall picture that yes, this area did set up similar to the other areas that I was hoping it would. And if I was there in February, or not February, maybe like March or April, like after the snow melted, it would have been super obvious right away. I would have found it like immediately. So it was just harder to find in the summer.
Is that the area you ended up killing that big Wisconsin?
No, this is a different area.
Okay.
This is one I was just there a few weeks ago.
Oh, okay, so you're looking for one of those other areas.
Yeah, it's a similar type of spot.
You went in there with the purpose to look at that.
Right.
What, 15 acres?
So if I was just willy nilly walking through without a goal in mind, like I would have been like, oh, yeah, there's some deer sign in here, but like
basically what you started the podcast with, what you're explaining exactly, trying to match that little pocket of what's been successful.
And like I said too, like whatever that is was not what I was looking for when I first started hunting that type of habitat.
Yeah, but you learned it.
Yeah.
And now you kind of target those areas. It's the same way with me for turkey hunting. I've learned where I can expect to find turkeys or where I typically go. So when I go in blind hunting in another state and I look at the map, I was like, I want to start here.
Oh,
It just
yeah.
kind of looks what, and sometimes you have success. But
Yeah, I would say that to play off that, it's like I always talk about planning a route with places to check off. And a lot of times I'm doing this in season because it's like a, you know, traveling trip. I don't really
you
hunt
guys
deer.
travel all over the place.
Yeah,
so
and I don't really hunt whitetails at home, right? Like I don't have a home place that I go to anymore. And when I go into these areas that do, you know, go down the checklist, a lot of times similar to what he just described, it's like I'll just be kind of blasting through, just getting to those areas. And I don't mean blasting through, but just not paying a ton of attention to the details until something really obvious catches my eye where it's like, whoa, that's a big rub, or this is a heavily used trail. And then I maybe start to investigate the little details. But a lot of times I've got these specific spots in mind that I'm going to check out. There has to be something pretty major in between for me to rethink everything because of the consistency of all the factors that play together where there's generally big bucks. Now, I miss tons of them, I guarantee it, because I'm moving so much to just go to those places one to the next that I have confidence in. I know I miss a ton of them, but I think having that plan and just following those lines to get back there, and then if it's not there, just pull out quickly. Like one example that I have, and I've been talking about this one a lot, but it's fresh, so you know it's an easy one to do. It was last season in Minnesota, and we wanted to check out this one spot. We made a pass. We found that the creek was a lot lower than what we thought. We're like, oh, let's walk down this creek and try to see if we can find some tracks crossing it. So we start walking down that creek, and it's like, yeah, at first there's some tracks, and pretty obviously doe tracks, and then all of a sudden the tracks just started going away, and there would be like less and less and less to where there was finally none. And look at the map, and it's like, yeah, we're kind of just burying ourselves into this monotonous habitat where there's nothing necessarily that would hold them on an edge, or not a lot of diversity in that area. So we pull out and we go to the next place that we have kind of some expectation that there could be a nice buck in there, and start walking those lines. And as we're walking those lines, certain things just pop up. And I think a lot of that, too, in the moment is just instinctive. Like if I'm walking and the path of least resistance goes that way, I check my compass and it's facing towards a transition of cattails and alder, for example. Well, if that trail's going that way, I'll just keep following that, keeping wind in my favor.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, always planning these routes too with wind in mind first. I guess I fail to mention that a lot because I just take it for granted that like that's what I do, you know. So like always going, if we've got a west wind, always heading straight into that westerly wind and just kind of following those edges. And ultimately what will end up happening most times is big clues pop up, whether that's a rub, scrape, or track, and then it's like, okay, let's start investigating where he could be going, where he could be bedding on an edge, and where can we ambush that buck, or where can we go in there and try to rattle him out of his bed. You know, just oddball stuff that you know, pops up in the moment. Just creating theories on the fly too.
Well, do you when you're scouting, do you pay attention to the wind at all? You know, like he's in season scouting.
For in season scouting a little bit more, but,
yeah, but
not during.
So okay, so you're not worried about bumping them out or anything.
No,
like that?
I mean a lot of times like I got this spot I want to track. Like, I don't have time to. I only got a certain amount of like days and like times of the day that I can even get out there. Like I'm not gonna wait for the right wind.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I'm just curious if anybody thought about that when they're actually scouting.
The only thing I think about when I'm scouting outside of season is wind currents through an area. So trying to
Take
pay
a note.
trying to pay attention. Like I will look at the wind direction. I'm not necessarily worried about spooking the deer.
Well, see, that was my question. It's like if you have the wind in your face as you're scouting, then you may end up getting real tight to him if he's bedded in there and you bump him. I would, in my way of thinking is I would want to bump him from 100 yards away and let him know he got out of there successfully.
I want to bump him at point blank. I want to see what I want to bump. I want to scare him to maybe get a visual on him to know what he is. And then
I guess I'm thinking I'm just not going to get that lucky to get that close, even if the wind in my face. And when he jumps, a lot of the stuff I scout is so thick that if he jumps up 20 yards in front of me, I'll never see him.
Yeah. I think in those situations, if it's in season, getting in there and being able to look at the fresh sign right now, like even if he doesn't run away, like get in there, smell it. Like, see if he smells big, you know, because I believe that's
Needs
true.
some Old
you know?
Spice.
If he smells, if he smells super strong, and there's, you know, the beds just get that stained smell of the tarsal gland, and then there are big tracks going out of it, or the bed's big. I mean, those are a lot of good clues to say, well, and to be honest, and it's a little different in a big wood setting because patterns aren't as similar, but if you know, it is some sort of broken habitat, or if you get in there and you bump him and there's all these big beds and it's just like, oh no, I stumbled on the lair. Like I kind of love that. I kind of love spooking him at this point because I used to get so paranoid about it that you just lose all hope. But if you can kind of just think to yourself, well, this isn't that big of a deal. He obviously loves this spot. And if the wind's in your favor, you know, he's going to come back and smell that you were there. But what's the difference between you and a coyote or a bear at that point? Like, you're just another thing passing through. Now, I think where things would get weird is if you were, let's say this is a private land setting and you do that same thing, you bump him out of there, and then you're like, oh man, this is the lair, and you know, carve out a tree, put a permanent tree stand in there, got sticks there, and there's all this like obvious human change that just happened. Now it's maybe like he comes in and he's like, I don't know about that, but just your ground scent through there. My opinion's changed on that a little bit. Well, quite a lot over the years.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, mine has too. Just from watching, just looking at the cameras, and like, oh, a bear went through, and then or a coyote went through, or a grouse hunter went through, and there's a deer right behind it. It's like I think they know, like they can smell that scent and know if it's they get you in the tree. Now you're in trouble. But if they just cut that track, I guess it's a behavioral
Just
thing
like
too.
a tracking dog knows
Yeah.
which direction a deer went. He hits that, and then he's like, oh, it went this way.
There's been a lot of times where I've had deer hit my ground scent and either not care or like acknowledge it clearly and then go back to what they were doing.
I've seen
Or
them
look
follow.
around,
I've
like,
seen them
just
I've seen
curiosity.
people's trail cameras like show that they're following that as well. It's pretty
I've had
interesting.
deer do it. I got up in the stand, and a deer was out there, I don't know, 100 yards, and cut my track and hit it and sniffed its way the exact path through the tall grass right to my stand. And it was a little young doe, but I was like, look at that thing, how curious it is. Other deer, I'm sure.
Did she follow your climbing sticks up the
No,
tree?
she got here. She got here, and where I'd laid the stand. This is back when I used those big, heavy stands, and I'd set everything around on the ground, and I got to take off stuff. I'm sweaty, and
Hell yeah.
I had screwing steps back then. They're still, I think they're still legal in Minnesota, but I don't use them anymore. But put that up. So the deer got there and was just smelling wherever I had laid all kinds of gear down, and it didn't really know where the final destination was. And so then it just kind of looked around and went about its way.
Worth mentioning too is that some of these areas I've been describing that are more rut focused for when they'll be good, those bucks aren't in there this time of year anyway. I might get, if I had cameras out in the summer, I might get 1 or 2 photos of the deer in velvet that just seem like they're passing through and they won't be back again until mid-October.
Sounds a lot like the area, I ran cameras in last year, and I haven't put any cameras this year. And I put on miles out there, hiking in this heat, and putting cameras here. And I'd run them here for a while, and I had like an array of cameras. Like if a deer comes through here, I'm gonna get it. And I got a couple, smaller but decent bucks, not huge, like 1 or 2 pictures of it. And so then I moved my cameras here, and then I moved my cameras, and I was like, I'm gonna cover this whole area. I'm gonna find out where they're coming and going from. And another fellow, a friend of mine, he had some cameras, and he said, oh, they never show up in here until later in the season. Sure enough, right as the season's about to kick off, late August, early September, on into September, these deer start showing up. And, it was basically useless for me to have my cameras out there because they were not using that area. I don't even know if they were ever using the area that I was concentrating on initially. I think they were just kind of getting to the fringes there. And so this year I didn't run any cameras. Sorry to put this all on my hunt.
It's all good. No, I
just thought
wasn't
like,
concerned about it at all.
This is Garrett supposed to be talking about big woods. Anyway, I'll briefly talk about this. But my thought this year is like, I'm not even going to waste time with cameras. I think that, to me, mentally, that starts screwing around my head, and I should I have more fun when, even if there might not be a big buck in there, I think there could be potential, and I'm sitting there.
Dude.
And so that's the way I'm going to hunt this year, and I'm going to go to where my friend sent me those pictures where those deer seem to be coming from. And so they do play a little bit of part, but I'm not going to run them and then chase my tail around like moving cameras around this year. But
yeah, that stresses me out, and I haven't used trail cameras for a while, and I think that it has helped me pay attention to some of the details that I wasn't earlier, and I think that it also just allows me to tap into instincts a little bit more and just kind of go with the flow and not worry about things as much, where if I know too much, it's actually a bad thing. You know what I mean? Like, even just a visual, sometimes I can tiptoe too much, where I think when I have this mentality of I'm going to just go hunting, I'm going to check these places I have confidence in, and I'm going to keep going down that line until something pops, I usually end up having a little bit, not a little bit, I have a lot better luck and I have more fun doing it. But I think that one of the things that helps in a lot of situations me find a starting point is the cover that is either keeping people out or is so dense that they can tuck in there and hide. Like, that's kind of the starting point. And that can look a lot different in big wood settings. So I'm curious what specifically on a map, if you were to say, like, or I guess also curious, do you find that still in big wood settings? Like, are you finding some sort of pocket that's like, that's security cover that deer can bed, or he can bed in multiple places through here, So I'm going to start in there looking to see if there's clues that he's traveling through. Like, because obviously you've hit on a lot of the historic rut sign, like the big licking branch or the historic rubs. But as a starting point, even if you're not going to nail down exactly where he's bedding, is dense security cover a factor in your decision making when going into a spot originally?
It's never not far away.
Okay.
Yeah. And it depends on the time of year. And I guess it's worth saying too, like this region that I've been hunting that's, quote unquote big woods, like there's big woods in, central Missouri that looks totally different.
Totally.
And Pennsylvania and Southeast and like everybody's got their own different brand of big woods.
But I do believe that there are some consistencies throughout. I think that's worth noting. Like what you just said about a while ago, the inconsistent patterns. People say that everywhere. Like it doesn't matter if you're like in Maine or if you're in Georgia or if you're in Arkansas or Wisconsin or Minnesota. That is a consistent thing where the patterns aren't as daily as much as they are like a looping type of pattern. Like that's a very consistent theme, I think.
And maybe if I found one of these, big deer in mid-September and he's eating white oaks, maybe that's a different scenario. Maybe he is doing the same thing day after day after day.
I think that does happen too, just based off of some experiences that others have had. I've never had that experience either, but I think it's probably pretty damn hard to find because you've got this gigantic area and it's like, well, he may be moving like 100, just like deer here, he may be moving 150 yards in daylight, and it's like to find that is. And
there may be enough security cover where it's like, okay, I'm going to go down and mark every single one of these possibilities, and you got 200 different possibilities. There's enough security cover in all of these places that could set up, because you might not be in the obvious spot. You might be in that one little weird overlooked spot that everybody talks about. The oldest buck being in, it's like, how am I ever going to get lucky enough to find that one spot? But that's what it feels like anyway.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. I don't think that's an easy thing to, I think, at least at this experience level that I'm at, I think it's just throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall until it sticks. Like I have no idea how to say there's some sort of consistent pattern, especially when you have not hunted an area for years and years and years and you know it like the back of your hand. Like that's going to be the best way to go about those early season hunts, I think.
Yeah. I know a guy that he's not super well known, but I looked up to him a lot and like try to follow what he does, because he's been hunting similar type of habitat for decades probably, and shot a lot of really nice bucks. And his strategy, he runs cameras too, but he scouts all the time, and he just builds this year over year library of data. And a lot of times he'll go out of state. Then he won't even do like preseason scouting out of state. All of his data is based on in-season scouting for 15 years. And then just through scouting while he's there, he's like, oh, I bumped deer here this year. I saw a big buck doing this thing this year. And now he can go in there. He knows exactly what to look for. He doesn't need to scout it in the spring per se. He knows those patterns, and like the year over year stuff, I think it's important everywhere, I think, but especially in big woods, a lot of times it's so key because it's so hard to get the other types of intel that you'd be able to get in other types of habitat.
Yeah.
And he's getting repeated years of in-season scouting, so what he's seeing is what he can expect to see the following year.
Yeah.
As long as the tree growth doesn't change a whole lot.
And like hunting pressure can screw it up, obviously. But like I've talked to him about hunting pressure too, and he's like, I don't worry about it. He's like, it ebbs and flows, and like deer will be deer. Yeah.
I think you need to.
Yeah, yes. I 100%.
I used to get frustrated when my hunts would get screwed up or I thought they got screwed up. Somebody would come through there, and I'm like, dang it, and I just leave. And nowadays, even like out in Nebraska, I had those guys dove hunting and shooting around me, and I stayed in the tree till dark because I've learned from just staying in the woods or staying in the tree. Maybe I'll move location. Most times I just stay there. Deer come out later on after these guys,
especially if they're not visibly blowing them out of there. If you anticipate that they're right there, And even if they're walking and their wind's blowing in there, if you didn't actually watch them come out of there or hear them come out of there, they're probably still in there, especially if you suspect they're in there already.
Yeah. I've seen deer come out and hunters walk by, never see the deer. The deer just looks at them, watches them walk by. And as soon as they get out of sight and the talking subsides, they go back to doing what they were doing. And I'm like, I can't believe that deer didn't run away, you know? And so, I mean, that's kind of the thought I have. I'm like, these deer live their lives out here. They get bumped. They learn to adjust. And if you just quit every time your hunt gets messed up, you're not going to see anything if you get out of the tree at that point.
Yeah.
You're already there. Just sit there another 2 hours.
Yeah. Question I have for you, what do some of your setups look like? And what are you looking for as far as setups go? And in addition to that, do you ever try to utilize, like in a clear cut or even a swamp where you can see a long way, do you ever utilize the observation type mentality?
Yeah, so usually it ends up seeming like my setups are kind of haphazard because they might be the best that I was able to make happen to be where I need to be. Mm-hmm. You know, maybe I'm in a tree where it's like, I'm kind of exposed here, but it's not really set up for a ground spot, and like I'll just have to be really still. And, you know, I always try to make it so that if I have a destination spot like a scrape, it's on my strong side. Mm-hmm. So I can just pick the bow up and come back to full draw and shoot. Like that's always my ideal. And it might be a ground spot where it's like, oh, you know, smaller aspen trees or whatever. Like there's not really, if I do climb that maple over there, like I'm going to be super skyline. That doesn't make any sense. A lot of ferns in here. Like, oh, there's a blowdown over here. If I go set a stool next to it, I got ferns covering my lower half of my body. I got this big, you know, 20-inch diameter tree hanging here that the deer are going to walk around. And like that one ground hunt, I kind of set up like that, the one I did the video on. Mm-hmm. And it was like, I saw so many deer just sitting there that had no idea that I was there because that tree was giving them, you know, a buffer that they weren't right up on top of me. But yeah, I had good enough cover kind of in front of me, behind me. I had, you know, little saplings in front of me and then a whole wall of them behind me. And just like the ferns that I could just sit there and, you know, film deer after deer go through over the course of a few days.
The big buck you shot, you were right beside a fallen tree, the root ball and everything.
Yeah, that's what I thought with that.
It seemed like that horizontal cover can kind of help you at ground level to help break up your outline. Then you're not just like, you know, this perfectly human form.
When I look through the woods these days, it doesn't matter what time of year it is. I'm like, there it could, there it could, there it could, there it could. Because you also do that when you're turkey hunting. I think when you're looking down through the woods and you see when you can see the ground and there's like nothing but tree trunks touching the ground and there's nothing else going horizontal, it's like that's a no-go. Mm-hmm. Turkey hunting's the same way. The only way you can get away with it turkey hunting is if you can keep, you know, you're going to call that turkey straight here and you're going to be able to keep your body square to that tree. That's the only way. But how often does that even work out, right?
Right here, and then you're going to be like this.
Yeah, and then he's going to be able to peg you sticking off that tree. But it's the same thing with bow hunting off the ground. It's like anytime there's just a jumble or something that just is
I love like
different.
what he has, the fallen logs. When I get up in, especially in the open woods that I hunt in Minnesota for turkeys, some of the spots, like you said, you feel like you're just stuck out there. And then there was one spot, there was like a tree there. Another one had fallen here. There was a tree upright, growing still. And I just got tucked in there. And
So
I
sweet.
felt like just my head was poking up. I was like, they're never even going to know I'm here.
you can get away with anything in those types of setups.
Yeah.
So like buried like you did behind that big log with those deer around you, that you're just part of the environment and they're just ignoring you.
Yeah.
Well, and if you think about it too, I always think that deer's vision is so, it picks up on obviously movement, but also just some standout blob. So and same with ours too. This is one consistency between our vision and deer's vision. If you're looking down through the woods and it's again that trunk after trunk after trunk after trunk, and then there is a down tree, you don't look into the specifics of that down tree. You just breeze over it, and maybe you notice that there's something there, but you're just breezing past it and you're not looking into the specifics. But it's easy to pick up on a specific if it's this oddball shape outside of a otherwise uniform setting with trunks just touching the ground. Like if you can see a bunch of trunks, man, something sticking off the side of it, everything picks up on that immediately. So horizontal and vertical cover mixed is how I always just generalize that. And that can look a lot of different ways, but trees are the best, down trees.
Overhead cover is nice too when you can find it. Or even like a little, spruce or something.
Oh, yeah.
Or you get like an aspen or, some kind of tree that's got like a pine or a spruce next to it, and the branches kind of like go past it, and you just tuck yourself right in there.
Help with shadows and everything.
Yeah.
You asked about glassing, and I wish I could do it more. And it seems like a lot of opportunities where I would like to do it or think there could be value in doing it. It's like, okay, I could glass from here. To get to there, I got to walk through all of this and get my scent over all of that. There's no clean access to get in there. And once I'm up there, I can see 100 yards.
Yeah.
Maybe it's like a little pocket of swamp, but then once you hit that alder line, it's like you can't see into the alders at all. Or maybe it's a clear cut, but it's like, the way that the land rolls, I can only really see this. I got to be 100 feet up to see further than that. And so it's always kind of that trade-off of like, what's the potential value I get for this intel versus the potential damage I could be doing by getting back in there and not having it be a hunt. But there has been times where I've been, say, hunting like on the edge of a lake, and I can see, I see moving up there, pull up the glass. I'm like, there's a buck walking right along that edge over there. I haven't scouted that before, and I go walk over there and check it out. So I definitely like to be able to see. It just doesn't always work out where it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, that's a challenge in big woods. Again, across the board, it's just there's too much stuff in the way to see very far, and that can be frustrating. But I was curious if there was any creative ways but the lake thing is a great example of that. Another thing in a setting like that I always think about is a river. If you could see down a river, now obviously every body of water is different, but if you had some sort of shallow river where you could see down a long lane, I've always liked that as well. And otherwise big timber, just because it's one good line, it's just a place. And
what are you looking for? Just watching deer cross?
Yeah, just deer cross.
So like a power line if you're hunting dry land.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to say next. But hunters are drawn to power lines. Like a lot of people do that in a power line setting, especially in a big timber setting. It's like, well, yeah, I can, rip a 300-yard shot down this power line with my rifle
too.
Yep. So I think, but otherwise, it is just a challenge. This is like I'm always trying to think of creative ways to get a visual in timber, because it's easy to write it off and say, well, you can't do that where I'm at. But it's like, well, I mean, it's worth at least thinking about it and trying it. Now it's hard. It's still hard. I will not disagree with that, but I think it's always worth trying to think of.
I've had some success with binoculars when I'm hunting timber, although it's very not strenuous. That's not really the right word, but it's you got to spend a lot of time just glassing off through the woods and the timber. And I've caught deer movement that I wouldn't have seen with my naked eye. But like I said, you've got to be constantly scanning deep into those crevices and stuff,
especially in low light.
Yeah.
And so I've given up on that for the most part. I keep them in my top pocket, little handy compact ones, just to, if I saw a flicker of movement, to check it. Otherwise, I mean, it's like I said, it's a lot of effort to invest in just scanning the woods constantly. And if they're that far away, they're not in bow range. But
and those are probably scenarios in which you're already out in the woods hunting.
Yes.
And so it's like, I'm going to use the glass because I got it. But that might not have been a scenario where it's like, I'm going to go glass this area.
Yeah, it's not
timber.
an observation.
Right.
It's I'm hunting a location based on my scouting or I think it's good, but I'm wanting to catch movement somewhere else. Or I usually just keep them there in case I see a flicker of movement and I want to verify what it is. And then if I can see it and maybe grunt them my direction. Otherwise, I mean, I'm not observing or whatever.
I often use glass in a timber setting in this way. Let's say I'm scouting or still hunting an edge and I start picking up on some sign, or I've come across a fresh track, looks like it's big and it's going the direction I'm going. And maybe I'm just instinctively and looking at the map, seeing transitions like, that deer could be bedded around here. Just peeking up, because a lot of times if you spend enough time in the woods, we all catch a buck has heard us coming in, and he's looking at us already, but he can't quite see us yet. But his antlers are giving him away, and I love looking for that. And I've picked up on it a few times over the years, but that's always worth it. To me, if you think you see something or you feel like you can, really get crystal clear through a little spot, even if it adds another 20, 30 yards to your vision, take a look real quick. I'm an obsessive glasser, not even from the standpoint of just, looking at a big area as much as it's just like, what's that? Nothing. Take a few more steps, and you're going to do it thousands and thousands of times before it even matters. But one time it does. It might be his tine sticking out from behind a tree because he hadn't quite seen you yet, and maybe that's when you look over here and you're like, I could tuck behind this, hit a grunt call, and he's coming right down that trail. Shoot him 5 yards coming at you. But
I don't think there's any excuse for hunters not to glass these days. Everybody seems to have a bino harness in front of their chest.
Yeah.
Seems to be the trend these days.
Oh, the bino harness is kind of a funny one.
It's
the most common.
One thing that's not glass related, but it's kind of observation related, something that I've just happened to notice over time, is that if I'm hunting areas that have been recently logged, and I might be accessing back in on the packed down roads or trails or whatever, just in the light of my headlamp, I'm like, there's deer over there, there's deer over there. I'm marking on my map. So I'm going back to the truck, and it's like, I'm not out there with a spotlight, but I could still tell there was deer out there just from the reflection of the eyes off in the distance, and the foliage is young enough that it's like, man, the last 3 times I come back to the truck, there's been deer back in that corner. And I go look at it and be like, maybe I should scout back there.
I love listening too, kind of along those lines. If I'm walking out in the dark, even if I can't see something, just hearing deer moving. So I feel like sometimes people probably get feeling like they're going crazy when they're walking out with me because I stop so often. And I'm kind of picky about it too, where I'll be like, stop, stop moving around, because I'm trying to listen for something, or I hear something.
Stop shuffling them feet.
Yeah. But if I hear something, I like to listen and see what it does, how it reacts, be conscious of where the wind's blowing. Am I spooking it bad, or is it just doing the same thing I'm doing? What the heck is that? So I also like to do that. And it's a little bit easier and this is, I guess, me assuming. I'm guessing you don't have quite as many leaves in some of what you would get in some of the Missouri big woods settings that you've hunted in.
Yeah, not quite that bad, but there's still a lot of leaves in drier periods, and in the fall you definitely. It sounds like you're a freight train going through the woods, but not quite as high of a density or a layer of leaves that you would get in some of those areas.
So how did you move through the woods? Now I'll give you an example. I hunted with Aaron and Ted during turkey season. I just accompanied that. I wasn't hunting, and Aaron was very slow, methodical. He would walk a little bit and he'd stop. I was like, what is he doing? He was just looking around. I was like, we're trying to get up here to this point. What's he waiting on? And it finally struck me. I always thought I was pretty good at moving through the woods, and I even talked about it, become one with the woods. But he took it to another level. And last time I hunted with you, I think it was in North Dakota. And even then you kind of moved somewhat methodical. Your next move, you were thinking about what you wanted to do, even though we had a destination in mind. So do you still do it that, or do you have it? Has it increased in any degree?
If it's an area that is still somewhat newer, then I might be more likely to go slow, especially if I think that whatever we're seeing is kind of interesting. But if I know for sure everything's telling me I need to be in this spot to hunt it, I'll just go fast until I get close. And depending on my excitement level for that hunt, I might stop 300 yards shy and just go, a step every, I'm leaving at noon. I'm getting out there early and just I had a hunt like that a couple of years ago where I was like, man, I know this buck's using this particular edge, and I was going to have to hunt on the ground. And when I got probably about 200 yards and I started going up this ridge, I just started going, wait till the wind goes, take a step. And it took me probably a half an hour to go that last little bit. And I remember as I was going through this little corridor of high stem count area, there was a scrape and a big old splayed track in that scrape heading that direction. I was like, oh man, it's going to happen. Weather was perfect. Everything was setting up right, and I kept going down that trail. And then I got to the log. There's a lay down log like this, and there's a tree sitting like this, and there's a big root ball down here. And I was sitting basically right in this corner. So my back was kind of up against that tree, and I had this next to me, and I was sitting on a little stool. I think I might have actually been sitting on the platform. And I had, let a few hours go by, and one deer had jumped up when I was getting set up. I think I stood to stretch because I didn't really have a pad to sit on. And when I did that, a deer jumped up on in the timber. I was like, oh crap! That could have been.
Was it bedded there and watched you?
Well, I don't think it could see me, but I think when I stood, the tree was small enough that the top of the tree.
But you got in there so slow and methodical, it never saw you approach.
It was probably 80 yards. I had no idea I was there until that happened. But I didn't see a big rack on it, so I was like, I don't think it was that deer, but it was a deer. Like, okay, well, anyway. So I kept sitting there, and another maybe hour goes by, stand up and stretch once again. And as I'm standing, and my bow is, basically sitting on that log, I hear crunch, crunch, crunch from behind me, directly behind me. The same trail that there's a little corridor that I walked in on. I was like, well, I can't move now because the tree that I'm standing next to is thinner than my body. So I can't even grab my bow. So I'm like, well, I'll just wait and, see when this deer walks past me. And it's this, this big mature deer that I was hoping to see, and I see him out of the corner of my eye from here to that corner of the room away, and I'm just like, oh no. He hooks around and he goes behind that root ball, and as soon as his eyes went behind the root ball, I grabbed the bow, hit the 360 camera, came back to full draw, and when he came around to the other side, trying to stop him twice, and he was just on a mission. When he came by, his mouth was drooping down. He was just kind of head bobbing side to side, and he was just on a mission. And it's like I maybe could have taken a really steep cording away shot, but just didn't quite do it. And had I not gone into that area super slow, obviously I, spooked the one deer as quiet, as patiently as I was.
But after you'd already got set up,
right? But that deer came in from the same way I did. So where was he? I don't know where he was bedded. He could have been bedding in a gazillion different spots along that ridge.
You probably passed him.
I probably passed him.
But you were slow and methodical. He didn't detect you,
right?
And
he came through daylight.
But did he walk over top of your scent trail? Where you
walked right on my scent trail, but continued to go past where I had stopped walking. So he clearly had smelled and didn't care. I think it might,
or maybe he was panting because he was running from where he thought you went that way.
Yeah. So one thought was that maybe that was the deer, and he circled back around.
Yeah, that's interesting.
What time of year was this?
It
was October 28th, maybe, prime time. It was a very aggressive deer.
The time when they start really chasing, leading up to the breeding. So yeah, I guess he could have been out chasing does, and
he could have. I like that idea though, that he could have been out and around
because he couldn't see me. I mean, if he did spook from the tree movement, he would have seen that, but he has no idea what it is.
Right.
And the thermals were kind of lifting up that hillside a little bit, but I don't think that it was quite. I don't think you could quite get my scent from there.
But you didn't get a good look on that deer that ran away.
No, I didn't see a big rack, but I didn't get a great look at it. Yeah. But the wind was also blowing kind of down the hill, like the main wind.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was actually a spike at some point in that afternoon as well that went downwind to me, and that spike spooked, and he ran out. But this deer was, upwind by 5 yards and no care in the world.
I like that question, though, because how do you move through the woods? I think that's something that is probably my biggest passion in hunting right now. That's, to me, the number one thing, because that's what I like to do the most. And I feel like there's oftentimes these discussions about ground hunting, and it's like, there's so much focus on, and I just did the same thing to you. It's like, well, what do you like to set up on? What time are you looking for? And all of those things are important, but at the end of the day, once you start to formulate these theories, it's like, how do you get in there without just blowing deer? And I think it's funny sometimes when I see a video of somebody and they're going into their stand, they're going to their spot. And it's just it's like I don't really ever move through the woods like that. I mean, I talk about sometimes being moving fast and just covering ground, and when I'm saying that, that's still really planned. Everything is still extremely planned. I mean, maybe to cover some distance and just get back on a trail to cut off. But as soon as you step off there, it's okay.
Like his example, the first 300 yards, he was blazing. And then you stopped 300 yards before there and crept in the rest of the way.
And even like one of my favorite things in the world to do is to be a driver in terrain, is on a deer drive, because I just get to be a deer that's moving fast. And I think that with the wind in your favor, you can play that incredibly aggressive, and it's crazy how much it works. Like all of a sudden you're just right on top of a deer, even a big buck, and he just doesn't know you're there, because if you're in tune with it, your speed can vary based off of conditions and wind, conditions like wet, wind, or even using terrain as cover for sound and movement. And I just think that one of my favorite like little moves, a move that I really enjoy, especially gun hunting. Now I wouldn't do this with a bow, but I shot a buck doing this in a muzzleloader drive a couple of years ago. I was coming up the nose of a ridge, and my job was to be kind of I was in the middle. I was the middle driver, so I needed to keep up with the pace. I couldn't get too far behind, because then everything would be done and they could get behind the other guys. So I'm going at full bore, and I'm going up this hill as fast as I can, and it's so instinctive too in these moments. But like the wind was blowing. The wind was blowing like this. So I was trying to decide. I'm like, well, which side of this finger should I go up? And I'm going as fast as I can go, still under control, and still be able to like pull up and shoot, and my heart not be beating so hard that I can't hold the gun steady. And just as I'm starting to get to the top, I make the decision to go to the downwind side of that finger, and I start to wrap around that. But right at the last second, it's like I'm going fast. And then it's like right as my head is about to start to, go around the ridge, it's like pump the brakes and go slow and pick a spot that I can go to where I can use that as cover. And I came around there, and there's a whole bachelor group of bucks. And the buck that I shot was rubbing. And it's like, I love the specifics of those moves. And those obviously vary anything from that high speed to take that back to a setting where you're sneaking down, again, that example of like cattails and alders, and you're on this little deer trail where there could be a deer bedded inside of 40 yards right now. And something's telling you, instincts or clues or whatever, and it's like, okay, I'm going ultra slow and I'm listening, and as soon as I hear his feet do anything, like, okay, now I'm pinpointing on that one spot. And I just really love that. That's like my favorite thing to do when you're in tune with the woods. And you're just feeling confident that there's something there, or you saw something. Better yet, you saw something go in there. Like, that's the most fun form of hunting to me. But that's different than other people, and that's cool. Like, some people really like to, like, I know I've heard people say many a times, I like to create a plan of what he's doing, figure out his pattern, and know that he's going to do this on this day at this time. And when he does that, that's the satisfying thing. Where, for me, my favorite thing is just like, here's the situation that you didn't expect, make it work. And I feel like that helps, or that's why probably I like that, being, in tune with the woods. But I think it's also why I like turkey hunting, because turkey hunting's a lot of that. I think,
What you just described is a lot of times what can occur during turkey hunting, where you're making a move, you got to get quick there. And because he's gobbling right there, and you've already figured out about where he's at, and then you got to put the brakes on, and then slide up to this tree, get low, and then you get set up, and then all of a sudden here they come. You just timed it right. You did everything right.
Yeah, and that's what gets me fired up, really, as you can probably tell, is my talking.
Yeah, we had
speed
this talk. We had this talk last year about your ground hunting and how you're exclusively almost. But we were talking about how I'm starting to do more and more ground hunting, especially hunting with a recurve, and it is exciting. I mean, once you It's a risk, or the way I picture it, it's a big risk, because there's so many advantages to getting there and getting elevated and be able to see farther. And that's hard for me to adjust to. It's having limited visibility. When you pick a spot and you sit on the ground to hunt, I'm already restricted in my range with a recurve. And now I can only see this far. And I'm like, if I was up in a tree, I could see what was going on
Mm-hmm.
over there. I may be missing out on something,
Mm-hmm.
you know? I'm doing
Yeah,
this.
for sure.
And so you really got to commit to that. But it is exciting, like you said. Though.
Well, the thing advantage you have is, as a turkey hunter, you're really good at listening. And I picked up on something from you that I think I do it, but I wasn't conscious of doing it until you said it. And now I'm planning for it a little bit more, is just being able to turn your head to cut the wind in the way that doesn't create that suction on your ear.
Mm-hmm.
That sound can, and it gets even more specific when you're talking about deer feet on the ground, because everybody knows it's like you got a wet day and the leaves aren't very loud. Like, you got to pick up on any little thing if you're trying to get deer moving. And the fact that you understand and you're so conscious of how to hear really well, I think that has been a big part of the adjustment to being on the ground and being prepared for the moment, is just listening. There's nothing aside from like the actual act of moving in on one, nothing more exciting than being like, wait, that sound wasn't normal. That wasn't just a squirrel scurrying in the leaves. That was something bigger. And sometimes that can be the case, and 20 minutes goes by before it actually makes another sound at all. And then, but if you really tune into that,
That's the sounds you need to listen to. The ones that are just the subtle little snap of a twig, or just the slight that sounds like a mouse in the leaves. When you hear the squirrels, like, and you're looking at them, those, don't even bother listening for that. I mean, what I'm listening to, like when it comes to deer, it's always those little, or just a little, that. I'm like, what was that? And I ignored it early on. And then all of a sudden you hear a little bit more, and you finally look, and there's a deer standing in bow range. You're like, how did he get there?
Yeah.
So those are the little sounds you got to listen to when it comes to deer a lot of times, unless it's the rut and they're just walking through timber and leaves.
Or chasing like that. But that's also an advantage too, where I think, and this is a question for you that I want to ask, is, are you ever in a situation where you're in those bigger timber where you can't see very much, but the conditions are allowing it so that you can hear pretty far? Have you ever been in a situation where either you've done this or look back on a situation and this could have been an option to hear deer chasing or moving, and you could follow or just cut in and just get into that action a little bit more? Because that's something that I always think is pretty fun to do, but it takes the right situation. And curious if you've ever done that, or if you just in general apply calling to many of your setups. Sorry, I know there's a lot to, to do there.
So last season I was hunting in one spot that was kind of like a spruce mix swamp. Like, it's kind of swampy, but not like standing water, but then it drops off into like an alder tamarack swamp that is wet. And I was in an area where there's like a trail coming out of it, and there was like a scrape line heading up further into the spruce. And I could hear one morning just like, oh, that definitely sounds like a deer rubbing a tree. Like, for sure, that's got to be what that is. And it was probably 70, 80 yards. And I could hear him walking around. I'm like, there's definitely a buck back there. And I could hear another deer, and it's like, it sounds like they're getting aggressive. They're not locking horns, but like, you can kind of paint the picture in your mind of what's going on. And then you can hear him grunting, and it's like, man, like, I hope they come in, because I was up in a tree, and I was like, but if I was on the ground, like, I could slip in. But instead, like in that scenario, I was just kind of playing like, well, eventually, and then they ran across the little swamp, and I could hear them up on the high ground on the other side. Then they eventually did come back over, and they were within range, and they're both smaller deer. But it was like, in that scenario, I probably could have gotten down and maneuvered my way to get to a shot. That's just kind of playing that scenario of like, like when Warb shot that deer the other, what was that, 2 years ago? Where it's like, he made the call to get down, and it was the right call. So it's like playing that risk reward. But yeah, there's definitely scenarios where that could be the case. There's also scenarios where it's like, I can hear the deer. I can hear a buck grunt once, then twice, and he's out in the tamarack swamp. It's like I can draw a line on a map exactly where he's going, and then where he's going to end up. And then eventually got into the spruces, and then he wrapped all the way back around, grunting the whole time, probably gunning 20, 25 times, and he ended up making basically a full loop around me, got back in front of me, and then walked in like a minute after shooting the light.
Jeez. And how long of a time frame was
It's
that?
probably, I'd have to look back at the footage to be sure, but probably 25, 30 minutes.
So in those situations, hindsight being, 2020 or like whatever you want to say that, like my perspective now, knowing how the story ended, could you have just been like, I'm going to move towards that and just started grunting your way towards him to like make a few steps and like thinking of it like how people call elk. Instead of bugling, you grunt, shake a tree, make it sound like you're rubbing. Especially if you can hear him, he's definitely going to hear you. Like he's going to hear you way better than you hear him. But if you disguise your noise with grunts and
Make it sound deer-like.
just kind of get into those next spots and similar to what I was just getting all fired up about earlier. It's like that's what gets me fired up. But it's also not everybody's style, so like I totally understand that because like there is a huge risk in it. You might just get down and be like, oh, I can get there quiet enough and like take two steps and boom, he's gone.
Yeah, or he already turned around and then he sees you getting down. And,
In that specific scenario, I probably wouldn't have been able to get closer just because like the area he was walking through is basically, this much water, and then you got cattails and other marsh grass and alder brush, and when you're walking through it as a deer, you've got like a wall on either side.
Yeah.
So it's like
So you couldn't have got in there and got a shot anyway.
But what I maybe could have done in that scenario is get down on ground level and start actually making some deer noise in addition to calling and maybe doing some kind of raking noise. I've tried rattling numerous times in the past and just personally not had much success doing it. I have had deer come in, and I think in that scenario I probably tried grunting a couple times. Did that play a role? I don't know. Would he have come and looped around and like maybe he tried to smell me and didn't perceive a threat and came back in? Maybe he would have done that anyway. There's no way for me to say for sure. But I always have a grunt call on me for that type of scenario.
Did you have an idea when he was going through the Tamarack about where he was going to pop back out if he continued on his course?
No, because he was going through, and I was like, for all I know, he could have just kept going.
Okay, so even if you got down, you wouldn't have had a anticipation of where he was going to pop out and move to that location.
Right.
Yeah.
And even once you get down to ground level in those spruces, it was like you could almost see better on the ground level than you could up in the trees. Whereas like when you're up in the trees, it's like pocket, and it's great for drawing back on a deer because you can be like, oh, here he is. I'll just draw back when he's behind this giant spruce tree, and then he walks out and you're ready to full draw. It's great from that aspect, but like once you get on the ground level, it's like, it's kind of hard to move now, and you're seeing their legs as much as anything.
Yeah. I always think that a strategy that would be fun, and especially not knowing these areas and being in season, would be take those routes. Timing's got to be right. You got to be in. You don't have to be, but November, late October, November, early November. It'd be really fun to just go spot to spot and just rattle and just cover ground and like just try to get reps in that way, where it's almost the same thing as like when trying to locate a gobbler. It's like sometimes you're just covering ground, just trying to cast as many calls as possible to get that response. And it's almost that same theory with, or at least in how I have it drawn up. It's like pick a potential bedding location, get as tight to it as possible, rattle. 20 minutes, give it 20 minutes, move to the next spot. Now, you're going to miss stuff. You're going to run bucks over, but there could be that one time. If you did that like 3 days in a row, 4 days in a row, my guess is at some point one's going to come blasting in because he's actually going to be there. There's probably going to be a bunch of times where he's just not there. But in a low-density area, I think it almost bumps up your odds for him coming fast, too, because it's like he's laying there. He doesn't know if there's another deer, 100 yards over here, or, the next one could be 500 yards away. Then all of a sudden, there's rattling just right over here. It's just like, well, I better go check that out. He's just maybe not expecting that. And I think that could work. I'm not saying it's going to by any means. You could try that for 10 years straight and it never worked once, but it seems like it would be fun to try. And I guess I always say that to people, hoping that somebody would someday be like, yeah, dude, I did that and it was nuts. Actually, I talked to a guy in Minnesota that did that, and he shot a, real nice one. It like makes all these ones kind of look like little
Well,
dweebs.
these aren't dweebs, that's for sure.
Well, this thing was like a 200-inch buck.
I have 2 questions. That is a big one.
That he just was like, as he bumped into him. His name's Jim. So if you're listening to this, Jim, what's up? But he shot this buck that he said that he was just bouncing from spot to spot, rattling, and all of a sudden he was just about to give up on it, and he heard a stick break and looked up, and
That's got me intrigued because I used to rattle a little bit, and I mainly kept it to like that later October time frame when I start seeing those scrapes pop up everywhere. And I can't recall ever having any success in afternoons. All my instances of rattling where I caught in a buck, and only one good buck came into rattling. Most of the times it was smaller ones. But I use smaller antlers anyway because they're compact. I can just pull them out. It sounds like a little 6-pointer. But anyway, they're always fast to arrive, and it's always in the morning, never in the afternoon. And so I've given up on that, and I really don't rattle much at all. If I'm in the woods late October, early November, I'll have those little ones with me. So have you seen the same thing, and when do you start rattling? Both of you the same question is it always in the morning where you have the most success or the only success at getting them in there? Because I'd be willing to try that strategy, just running around and trying it.
I would say that I don't think exclusively morning or evening. I don't necessarily think of a time of the day. I think time of the year is pretty accurate. I think that if areas are heavily pressured and people are hunting them a lot, that a mature buck would get call shy to rattling at some point. But I also think of it from the standpoint that most hunters that rattle in a tree stand, and they make no noise. Man, have you guys heard bucks fight? Like 2 big bucks fight. It sounds like the world
just on TV.
Yeah. But even then, that's a great. I think it's a great example. It's like it sounds like the world is exploding. But it's not the antlers. It's the ground. Logs are breaking. Leaves are getting pushed back.
You could almost rattle one up without rattling.
Yeah.
You just make enough commotion.
A bunch of commotion.
And they're probably going to, yeah.
I try when I'm rattling to focus on ground noises and big ground noises more than I worry about any specific strategy with actually touching the antlers together. And a lot of times I'll just lock them and then just kind of, just to give you an example of kind of what it sounds like, more of a
grind
crunch, just big versus like tickling tines, right? I want it to sound like 2 bucks are like physically locked up and they're pushing each other on the ground. And, when 2 big 200-pound bucks are pushing each other, they're going to make a log like this just snap in an instant. So like breaking big stuff, like pushing those leaves out are all things that I'm trying to do. Or I'll bump into a tree or something that I know it's going to shake and all those leaves are going to just doing ridiculous stuff.
Didn't you rattle one up in Tennessee like that up on top of that hill?
Yeah, that was in Ohio, but yeah.
Oh, Ohio, sorry.
But
on a hill somewhere.
Yeah. But both that time and then the day before we rattled in a small buck and happened immediately. But
what time of day was that?
That was the small buck was in the morning. Second one was more like late morning, early, probably like 10.
Okay.
And then one time I rattled in a big buck with my brother at like 3 p.m. Man, those are just ones that pop into my brain right away. But to me, rattling's so hit or miss. It's like they're either just coming or they're not.
That's probably why that strategy of just running and gunning, running and rattling.
Yep. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. A lot more realistic. It's probably the most unrealistic thing is same spot every 30-minute interval.
Yeah.
Right.
No supporting noise.
Especially if he's just laying there, 150 yards away and he's tired and he's not feeling super fired up. Where, on the other hand, I think think of this situation. Big buck's laying in the cattails with a doe, and all of a sudden you start rattling and you're 80 yards away. He's like, I got something to lose here. I'm getting up now and I'm coming over there. Where if a buck's been cruising all night, he's tired and he's asleep middle of the day, and you start rattling and he wakes up. I mean, for him to change his mood, some bucks' personality's probably aggressive enough that they could do it, but that's why I think it's so hit or miss. It's like he may hear it and just be like, I'm not going over there. I got nothing to lose, like, you know.
It's
But
like
I don't
call
know.
them turkeys. Got to be in the right mood.
Yeah.
It's a lot like that. I mean, I think of a buck coming in flying into a rattling sequence is a lot like a fired up tom that's gobbling the whole way in. It's very similar. And the nice thing, too, is you can hear them coming a lot of times. Like, now, the one thing I learned, because you brought up the one on the ridge, have your bow handy.
Yep.
That's the stupidest mistake.
Oh, I
talk
learned
about
that early
all the
on
time.
because they, like I said, they come
they
quick.
come in quick.
When they're coming, they usually show up in the first minute. As soon as you put the antlers down,
Yeah,
sometimes you don't
usually.
even get a chance to put them down.
Yeah, in that situation, they were still in my hands, and he looked to my right, and he was already at like 12 yards and coming
They're
closer.
like a hot 2-year-old gobbler. When they're ready, they come running.
Yep.
And that's what it is.
So I just,
Yeah, I've never had one come in after I've rattled and I've waited there a couple minutes. It's either they're there or they don't ever show up.
I think one other thing that can happen is they can come in way later. Yeah, and come
And
down
cautious.
in cautious.
Circle down.
And that's why I mentioned earlier, if you're doing like 20-minute rattle, wait 20 minutes, go. I think there's still some that you're going to miss because some big bucks might just be like, you know what, I don't have a doe. I don't really know what's going on over there, but I kind of want to check it out, and they'll kind of cruise through it. And I think depending on the time of year, like I could see that happening at the front end of that time frame, like late October, like let's just say October 25th or December 1st. I could see that happening where it's like you rattle and they're like, I don't really know that I need to go over there, but curiosity gets the best of them. I mean, it could happen at any time, but that's kind of when I think that that's more likely to happen. And when the super aggressive thing happens, it's like he's locked down with the doe now, or he knows that, you know, it's time, and that's when he's coming flying in. But I don't know. That's just my opinion. I don't know. Somebody else could have totally different experiences.
What's your experiences with rattling? Morning time?
I've never had. I don't even know if I've maybe like one or two, but there's not like a scenario. There's not a scenario that pops up in my mind or a memory where it's like, oh yeah, that like what you just described. Like I can't really remember that happening. In a lot of years, I've not really rattled that much, but when I have tried it, I just keep having these experiences of like, didn't work again, you know. So
yeah, you feel kind of stupid after.
Right.
You know,
Oh yeah.
I feel
I do
worse.
too.
I feel
Yeah.
worse after rattling because
Like,
if I wouldn't have rattled, I probably would have had. You know, I feel like if I rattled and nothing happened, I just worsened my chances.
I think the same way. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna rattle. It's getting that time of year. Then I get them, and I'm usually in a tree, so I can't snap limbs and stuff. And I'm just trying to make it as aggressive as I can, and then I put them down and I get my bow because I know I've had deer come in before. And I sit there and nothing shows up, and I'm like, well, I just scared everything out of the woods. And I'm not gonna see
might as well
anything.
go to the truck.
But I stick with it. But
I think that's probably what I would say would be most hunters' hang up is that you do it and then you do kind of feel dumb. I mean, me too. Like you guys definitely aren't alone. I'll rattle and do it and make a ton of noise and just be like, dude, why'd you do that?
I don't think I've ever had one rattled in Minnesota, but in Wisconsin, where I was growing up.
Here we go, Ryan.
it's-
Those Wisconsin deer, they're
It's
so
totally
easy,
different.
right?
They're totally different.
Man,
No,
you cross the
there's-
river and it
there's
just gets easy.
one spot. No, it was crazy. It was like you'd rattle and they'd come running in. And I just remember there's a decent sized one came in, and I was like probably my second year bow hunting. Grabbed my bow, pulled back, the arrows up off the rest, end up shooting, 15 yards in front of them. It was just an absolute show. But that was one place where it was unreal. Like it worked. And now I just feel stupid when I do it, honestly.
I think sometimes too, like I mentioned earlier, it's just a matter of there isn't one there right now to where like, maybe to help boost the confidence in the situation you just use a second ago where it's like you rattle and you think you scared everything away. It's like, well, there might just not be anything there right now, and 30 minutes from now he could come cruising through. I think that happens a ton too. Like I think back on all the times where I've thought that same thing, but then later one comes through and it's like, well, he probably just wasn't even in this zip code at that time, you know. But
Do you blind call for deer grunting?
a lot.
Okay.
And we all do.
And
like everybody in this group, I think you'd be amazed at how much, like you can't put every time we blind call into a video. We grunt, rattle, call, like shake branches. We make so much noise on purpose. It's hard to even actually explain that in a hunting video.
And do you use grunt calls just kind of like
Occasionally.
blindly?
Like when we were hunting together that one year in North Dakota, we grunted a couple times, and it seemed to calm. Like I think we grunted like right before the first deer came in, and then they came in right after. So maybe there's a calming effect there. I think we grunted while the does were there too, at one point. But I'll do blind calling occasionally with grunt tubes, but I feel like I've usually had better success if I knew there was deer there. But I do think that just generally my strategy moving forward is probably less calling if I'm actually in a tree or that's the only sound I can make. More likely to do it if I'm on the ground where I can add supplemental noises. And maybe instead of bringing a nice lightweight compact rattle bag, maybe I go in and bring a couple big sheds that can, rip it up and down a tree and make some noise that way. And
yeah, that's actually a preference of mine too. That's evolved over the years. Like the bigger the antlers, the better for rattling. Just big, massive.
I'd probably see bigger deer if I took bigger antlers with me, but I don't
They
want
probably
the bolt.
carry sound better.
I don't want the bolt.
Oh, yeah.
Well, the ones I have all those little nodules on the base, and so there's not much to it, but you can put them together like that, kind of like those black rattle things.
Oh, yeah.
But I just put them in, and I can grind them, and it sounds like you're talking about. And it's not. I guess the mass of them's not huge, so it sounds like two smaller bucks just. And I've usually rattled in smaller bucks. Now I did rattle in a pretty good one year, and that's a funny story. I didn't get a shot because of what my girlfriend did, but I guess I'll tell her I brought it up. She likes to organize, right? And so she went in my truck and she organized my stuff. And I like to leave stuff out in the back of my truck. So in the morning I'd get it and I put this on, I get this and put it here, and I'd have everything. And I get to my tree and I'm trying to put my camera arm up and this part's missing. I'm like, where in the world's it at? Why don't I have it? It should have been. She organized and so she tucked it away and so I didn't end up with it. So I'd rattled and then I'm trying to mess with this and here comes a big 8-pointer, tall, nice, like kind of like that in back there in the corner, but not quite that big. And because I was fiddling with that, had she not organized anything, I would have had the camera set up and my bow. Could have made a good shot. And I went home. I think I called her before I left the woods.
I'm sure.
Like, you were in trouble. Don't ever touch my stuff again, But back to your point about the calling. The reason I asked that because I used to blind call a lot, and I'd see deer sometimes. I had success with it, so I continued to do it. But probably 5 or 6 years ago, maybe more, I had this buck that I saw one evening, and I kind of picked the spot because I thought it pinched down the activity. And I think it was a doe came through, and then an hour later he come through, and I thought, okay, he may do that same thing tomorrow. He come out of the bed and I knew where it was at. Or another buck may do that. I'm going to go back to that spot. I didn't get a shot at him. He kind of slipped through where I couldn't get a shot. Next afternoon, I went in there, and about the same time that he came through, I was sitting there alert, waiting, and didn't see anything. And it got past that time, and I decided to do some soft grunts, just blind call. I'm sitting there, I hadn't seen anything. I'd made a couple more little grunts, and I just put it away, and I waited. Got dark and never saw the deer. But as I'm getting down, I saw a light off in the distance. Another hunter had gotten there before I did, and I didn't know that he was in there. And right about the time that deer came through the previous day, he came through the same day, and the guy, he was watching him. He said, I didn't have a shot at him, or I would have shot him, but he was going right. And I didn't know you were there, he was telling me. But he was heading right towards you. And then I heard you grunt. And he stopped in his tracks. And he looked that way, and you grunted again, and he just turned around, and he walked back the way he came back in the bed. I never would have known that. I just thought, okay, that deer didn't show up this day. And ever since then, I won't call to a deer unless I have visual.
Yeah.
And because I'm worried about how many other deer out there hear that. And maybe it was something the way I grunted. Maybe it didn't sound natural to him, or maybe he had a bad experience from that location. Because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, if it sounds like a genuine deer calling, I was in a tree, so that doesn't sound genuine. Deers aren't up in the trees. But I tend to think, like, if it sounds actually like a deer, it shouldn't scare them.
Yeah.
But something, and that's one case. And so ever since then, it's made me call shot the blind call, rather.
Yeah, I would say I would prefer to see one, but I'm especially likely to blind call if I feel like there's not any good way for them to get downwind, and I'm on the ground too. I guess I'm always assuming too that I'm on the ground, but if I don't think a deer can get downwind to me, there's some sort of barrier, or even if the barrier is just it's too thick for them to go that direction, I think I'm way more likely to just be calling my way through an area. And yeah, I mean,
but you're doing it on the ground.
Yeah,
so that's
totally
natural.
Yeah,
for the sound to be coming from there. And I've thought about that also when I'm moving through the woods, like we were talking about earlier, like creeping through the woods and quiet. And there's been times where my noise, I think, has attracted deer, where they think I'm another deer coming through the woods.
Absolutely. I think of countless times where that's happened, and it's a lot of times, especially if you're like thinking about a setup and you're trying to get to that spot, or you're at that spot, it can catch you off guard big time. Where, my dad actually shot a buck one time that totally came into him putting his climber together at the base of the tree. He was putting it together, and he might have like heard a deer move through, just out of sight. And as soon as he got down, he started putting that together, and he was like, "What's that?" Next thing you know, buck's coming up, gets behind a big boulder. One of the areas that, like, around the area where he grew up and where I grew up a lot, or grew up hunting a lot, over where my grandparents still live, there's tons of bluffs and boulders, like giant rocks. A small one would be like the size of that freezer. And this buck comes up, and he said it was on the other side of that boulder, and he could see its antlers, and he's like, "Yep," draws her back. As soon as it stepped out from behind that, he shot it at like 7 yards. Wow. And he was like, it totally hurt. And I mean, he, when I was a kid, he would drill that story into my head, like, to be conscious of that, right? Like, if you're moving through the woods and you think you hear something, it might be a deer that thinks you are a deer too. And I mean, it holds true still. There's one time Jake and I were in Alabama, and we were going in to make a setup. We had found some sign that we were confident that, was fresh, and we were setting up our saddle stuff, and I'm like a stick up, and I just hear Jake be like, "Zach, Zach." I look up, and there's a buck like on the other side. I'm facing the tree, standing on a stick, and the buck was like 6 yards away, and just totally nailed us.
Is he doing that?
Yeah. Who's that guy? And that didn't work out. But I think that calling, making some noise, and I mean, as long as you can dial it back and make it as natural as possible. Like, we inevitably do not sound like a deer, just our cadence is not the same. We have 2 legs, they got 4. But if you can try to match that, or add any supplemental things like grunting. And also, a deer stops a lot. Like, watching a deer walk through the woods, there's rarely a time where they get that zombie mode about them, where they are on a line and they aren't stopping. Especially earlier or later in the season, they're going to probably stop, look around, take a minute to, see what's going on, and then they'll take off again. And if you can match that and then throw a little grunt in there, I really like that when moving around. But, well, guys, I think we should wrap this one up because I'm about to run out of card space on that camera. So I appreciate the conversation, and I feel like I learned a lot about like your mentality going into it, and I think that just the conversation obviously opened up and got all over the place, got to talking about calling, and I think that was fun to hear different perspectives. And
I enjoyed interviewing you two guys.
I love talking hunting with you guys, all of y'all. It's a lot of fun, and hopefully we get to do it a lot more as we continue to live our lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
Appreciate it, guys.